That's good. So, okay, without further ado, if you're new to Civic Nebraska, welcome. Our mission is to help build a stronger, more inclusive, and robust democracy across our state. My name's Alan Klopek, and I'm the Rural Civic Health Programs Manager with Civic Nebraska. Um, uh, we believe at Civic Nebraska, our values are the foundation of everything we do. We believe in the power of community to create change, the importance of innovation to meet challenges creatively, and a commitment to learning as a lifelong process. We work to build power among communities and people, especially those too often left out. And we approach our mission with relentless optimism about what's possible when we work together for a better democracy. A lot of people ask why our logo is a honeybee. Well, Civics Nebraska's mascot is the noble honeybee, most commonly seen and one of Nebraska's most ubiquitous, frequently friendly flyers. It's a common misperception that bee societies are monarchies. In actuality, honeybees make decisions collectively and democratically. Every year, faced with the task of choosing and traveling to a new home, they undergo a process that includes collective fact-finding, vigorous debate, and consensus building. We believe that what works for bees also works for humans. Decision making and moving forward um, together must include debate, shared interest, mutual respect, diverse solutions, and faith that the majority can be counted on for a wise resolution. Such pro-social aspects are what makes democracy a most powerful organizing force in human history. And like our winged friends, it's what we seek to sustain at Civic Nebraska. Okay. So I will start to share my screen here. One second. Again, we appreciate you being here with us today for this presentation by Dr. LJ McElravy. I'll go a little bit more into our work. So a little bit more about Civic Nebraska. We carry out our work through three core program areas: voting rights, youth civic leadership, and civic health, supported by our dedicated administrative teams like Steve Smith, who you've seen earlier. They help bring this vision to life. Steve once told me that our programs serve everyone from 6 to 106 years old, from instilling civic pride and leadership into the hearts of young people to registering 72-year-olds to vote for the first time. And I think that's a really beautiful way to view our program and our work, and how it affects all of us every day. Um, so, a bit more on my specific department, the Civic Health team. Civic Health can be a confusing term for people, so here's how I choose to describe it. Civic Health reflects how engaged we are with our communities, whether that be at a city hall or on our front porch, in a voting booth or at a neighborhood gathering. It measures how we show up and reach out for each other, how we work together to solve common problems, and how well our institutions reflect the people they serve. We at Civic Nebraska use these pillars seen before you as our guiding principles in defining what civic health looks like. Civic action deepens the idea of community and political involvement by highlighting everyday ways people show up for each other, whether that be through volunteering, voting, protesting, or helping a neighbor. Civic trust, which we'll learn more about today, captures not only confidence in institutions, but also trust among neighbors, representation in leadership, and feelings of optimism and inclusion. Then we have civic access, which acknowledges that engagement requires opportunity. Like broadband access, we seek representation in leadership, transparent government, so that all Nebraskans can participate in meaningful government. And then finally, uh, act, civic knowledge, sorry, which brings an importance to the importance of being informed, understanding systems, and having the tools to engage thoughtfully in a thoughtful, effective discourse. So without further ado, here is Dr. LJ McElravy to discuss civic trust in rural Nebraska. So I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate that. I'm going to now get to the process of sharing my screen. Make sure I share the right one. Okay, hopefully you can see that. All right. So, well, it's great to be here. I love having the opportunity to talk to folks about the rural poll specifically, or broadly, and then, specifically I get to talk about some of our most recent poll results. Earlier this fall, I was in a meeting and we were asked to share what we're most excited about in the fall. People were talking about leaves and football. Mine is that we release the Rural Poll results. The Rural Poll results start coming out in September, and then we keep releasing them. And that's one of the highlights. People thought that I would like to comment that maybe I'm a little nerdy. I think that's probably pretty accurate. But today I want to talk to you a little bit about some of these initial results that we have. But I want to talk first, give you a little bit of background. Our Rural Poll team, we have a great team who works on the Rural Poll. So you've got several of us from the Agricultural Leadership, Education, and Communication Department. So I see both Dr. Heather Aiken and Becky Vogt on today. So thanks for joining. We also have a couple of faculty from agricultural economics. So Cheryl, good to see you. Thanks for showing us your great face over all the way over in the Panhandle. And then Brad Lubin is also a member of our team. And then we have several folks from Rural Prosperity, Nebraska, Mary Emery, Katie Larson, and Russell Schaefer. So that's our team. It's one of the best teams that I can think of working on. So it takes a lot of work collaboratively to put together a poll. And so thank you all for being able to join us today. I should note that they have not previewed what I'm going to say, so don't hold them accountable for it. I'm responsible for my own remarks today. The little bit about the Rural Poll. This is, we go through this process every year where we start collecting questions. Generally in the fall, we start thinking through what our questions are going to be. We put the survey together in the spring. We send it out, hopefully sometime in the spring. This last year, it was in the summer. And then we release the results in the fall, and then we start all over again. So it's very cyclical. But one of the opportunities that we have are for communities or organizations, if they want to contribute to the poll, either through questions. They have the opportunity to ask questions. And so we have partnered with a number of different organizations in the last couple of years to provide that opportunity. We haven't done this yet, but we'd also be interested in working with communities who might be interested in, oversampling their community specifically to get more information about their community. So those are just opportunities that I thought I would share a little bit about the Rural Poll. And if you're interested in that at all, please just let me know. So I mentioned that we have this kind of cyclical process that we go through every year. So every year we ask a core set of questions. And so this is about half of our survey. It's a 16-page survey, which is long. We know. We got lots of people who want information. And so lots of different kinds of information. So our poll, we limit it to that. And so we always ask about elements of the community, we ask about well-being, and we ask a number of demographic information to help us kind of situate the data. We also have, so half of our survey is rotating topics. And so throughout the years, we've rotated topics. Sometimes we visit them after a certain period of time. What I'm talking about today, in trust and confidence in institutions, is actually a question that we accidentally ask every 4 years. That was not necessarily planned out. It just so happened that that's how it worked, and it kind of situated well, given, after an election cycle, federal election cycle, presidential election cycle, we kind of are asking these questions, and so it's kind of interesting to kind of take a look at that. But we've had some really great questions the last couple of years, and so just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. And so people are answering these questions, the specific trust questions, but they're also answering a series of other questions, and people have the opportunity to provide that insight. And we'll have plenty of other webinars, and I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. So some of the details on our methods. So it's a mailed survey, so people self-administer the questionnaire. We identify 7,000 randomly selected households across rural Nebraska, and I'll tell you what rural means to us in just a moment. But it's 86 counties. And so this year we had about a 14% response rate. As you can imagine, response rates for mail-in surveys are typically going down. So it's not a great response rate, but one that still provides us confidence in our response, and gives us an error rate of about plus or minus 3%. One of the things that maybe we get the question a lot of, how do people fill it out? Even though it's a mail survey, people can respond online. So when they get notification of the survey, they get a link. So if they want to complete it online. And so this last year, about 37% of the folks who submitted the survey did it online. Again, it's only available to those who we mailed to keep it random, because that's the foundational principle of the survey. And the way I like to describe our method is that it's thorough and just short of harassment. So we send a notification letter to say, hey, we're going to send you something, but you can also fill it out online if you want to. Then we mail out the questionnaire. We give them a reminder postcard. And if they haven't done it, then we send them another survey to remind them. So we give them plenty of opportunities to complete the survey. So when we talk about rural for the sake of the rural poll, and maybe for those of you, some of you I'm sure know this, there's not a specific definition of rural. The idea of rural can be quite subjective. We tend to rely on some of our federal agencies and their definitions. And in some definitions of rural is anything that's not metropolitan. And so we kind of operate that way for the most part. So we don't include any counties that are within the Lincoln and Omaha metropolitan areas. So in Lincoln, that includes Lancaster and Seward counties, and then in Omaha, you can see that grouping. Although up in the northeast, there is a metropolitan community, but when we look at Nebraska, we see that region as more like the rest of the state than Lincoln and Omaha. So we continue to include that, even though in 2013, another piece of interesting information is that Grand Island became a metropolitan area or micropolitan area when it passed 60,000 residents. So we continue to include that as well, often for historical stake. But again, Grand Island is more like the rest of Nebraska than it is like Lincoln and Omaha, those kind of in many ways. So we try to continue to include that. So here's the big results. And so there's a lot of data here. And so I'm going to break this down, but this is kind of our results in a nutshell. Looking at the question, how much confidence do you have in certain institutions? And so we ask this question, and I'm going to break it down in different ways to kind of help us make sense of this data. But you can see we give folks 4 response options. They can either have a great deal of confidence, quite a lot, some, or very little. You'll notice at the bottom it says 25, and that's because that's through the year 2025. We've asked these questions, almost all of these questions every year. There's actually an exception to that, but I can share that in a moment. But we look at what institutions do people have a great deal of trust in or very little, somewhere in between. And so kind of giving you a big picture view. But like I said, I'm going to break this down and kind of look at it from different perspectives. So first, one of the kind of general principles that we've kind of identified through years of collecting data is that people tend to trust institutions that are closer to home. The closer to home they are, it's not universally true, but that tends to be. People trust institutions like their public safety agencies or the things that are in their community. And so for the most part, that rang true again in our 2025 results. Public safety and public libraries actually were the 2 entities or 2 institutions that had the greatest amount of confidence. Local government having less than those 2, but still, I've been thinking mostly about combining a great deal and quite a lot as kind of a category of people trust those or have confidence in those institutions. Some means I'm a little weary, and then very little means I really don't trust that organization or that institution. And so in general, we see that local institutions have some level of trust. Again, with public safety agencies in the communities and public libraries being the 2 with the highest. And then we also, one of the other questions that we've asked a number of years is confidence in voting systems. And so this one follows the trend that we might expect. voting and election systems in their county. People have, we see that 58% of folks either say they have a great deal or quite a lot, in comparison to voting and election systems across the nation, where we see 33% of the folks say they have very little, and then 40% say some. So we see quite a bit of difference between how much confidence folks have in voting in their county and trusting the voting that happens in their county versus more broadly, more nationwide. And so that follows the trend. And what I think is interesting about this specifically is that when we started collecting this data in 2017, we did not have in the state of Nebraska a voter ID requirement. And so what's interesting is that I think we'll show a little bit later the degree of change that has occurred over the course of those years. So then if we look at confidence in federal government institutions, so this is another one that, I mean, in some ways is working in a different way than we might expect, where the presidency and the executive branch there's more confidence in those institutions than there are in the more locally elected statewide or state representatives, both in the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate. Those are identical numbers for both of those institutions. There's not a great deal of confidence, or quite a lot of confidence, in either the House or the Senate, with very little with quite a few people having very little confidence in those institutions. The Supreme Court operates somewhere, it looks like the response somewhere in the middle between those two, where about 24% people say they have quite a lot or a great deal, and then 30% saying they have very little. So very little trust in the institution. And so I think this gives us some insight on, even though of these different institutions, the presidency and executive branch has more trust than the others, there's still not a great deal of trust within the presidency and the executive branch, which is, I mean, I think it speaks to how well our rural respondents see the executive branch representing them, or fulfilling what they think their needs are. And then if we look at state government institutions, so we look at the state legislature, governor and executive branch, and then the state court system. So these were pretty close to the same, in that somewhere around 25 to 30% of folks said they had a great deal or quite a lot of trust in those different institutions. The governor and the state executive branch having a little bit more confidence than the other two. And at the same time, you see that the governor and the state executive branch also had the most responses for very little confidence. So there's kind of both ends of that perspectives on a great deal or quite a lot, and very little. So I think that rings true to our current politics of the moment, right? Of how polarized some of our politics have become, and what we think of of government and how they're responding to what we need. So this one, this is a slide I just wanted to look at different executive branches. So if we were following the general rule and expectation, there should be the most confidence in our local, then in the state, and then in the presidency. And that doesn't quite pan out the way we might expect. So there's a great deal of confidence in the presidency and executive branch, so 17% of our respondents. When we combine a great deal and quite a lot, we see that both local and the presidency are close to that 40% range. So about 40% of folks have a great deal or quite a lot, whereas the governor and state executive branch is a little under 30%. And then, but at the same time, again, we see kind of this polarization of perspective where we see that 38% of our respondents have very little trust in the presidency and the executive branch. And that the local government has the least, only 16% who have very little confidence. And so in general, it would seem that there's some level of confidence for local and municipal government, and a little bit less for the governor, and then the presidency and the executive branch is kind of polarized in how you view how our respondents view and trust that institution. So one of the other entities that we asked, and so this was the first time that we had asked about higher education in this trust question, in part because we were just trying to get a sense of as an entity and kind of understanding what's happening in higher education in today's politics, and also with budgets and everything like that, trying to get a better sense of how people are feeling about that organization or those types of organizations. And so in this case, we see that the community colleges actually have the most trust, and that kind of breaks our rule of the closer, the more likelihood that people are going to trust, because the public schools within their community, we would expect that to be a little bit more trusted entity, but that's not the case here. So we see that about 60% of our respondents said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the community colleges. Public schools were a little less than 60%. And then public institutions of higher education, four-year colleges and universities, were around that 50% mark. And so interesting to just see how this breaks out. I think, as we look at the landscape of higher education, we see community colleges playing a major role in employability and workplace development and workforce development. And so I think that that specifically might be playing a role in how people are viewing community colleges. And what's interesting about the public schools, and we'll see this in a little bit, but we've seen this decline over the course of several years. And not sure why that might be the case, but it's interesting to kind of look at some of these trends over time, which we'll do in a few minutes. So one of the things that I thought would be helpful to look at is, broadly looking at public safety, or sorry, looking at where do people have the most confidence in institutions. And so when we look at entities that have the most confidence from our respondents, again, I combined a great deal and quite a lot. We see that public safety and public libraries are at the top there, with seeing somewhere around 70%-ish people saying that they have confidence. So a little over 2/3 perhaps of our respondents saying that they have confidence in that, in those institutions. This is the first time that we ever asked about public libraries. We had that recommendation from our libraries here on campus, and so I think they're happy with these numbers, to know that they're a trusted source. It's interesting too, when we think about public libraries within rural communities. I think about, I'm familiar with David City, that's where my family's from, and I think about the library being kind of a central part of the community. And I didn't know to what degree that might be something that's shared across rural communities, but it appears that very much is. And so the public libraries are held in trust. And I would say the same thing with public safety agencies and communities, where we see this would include things like first responders, police, firefighters, EMTs. And so I know, again, in rural communities, a lot of these places have volunteer organizations, especially for firefighting and emergency response. And so, you know, the level of participation within the community might be another reason why there's trust in it, and that you know that you have people contributing it. You likely know someone who's on the volunteer fire department, and so that maybe raises the trust that you have in that institution. Kind of going down the list, we see community colleges being up there, voting and election systems in the county being something that's quite trusted. So when we get to that bottom of the list, we're seeing more federal agencies, the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the Supreme Court being the ones that people have the least amount of higher levels of confidence. And then kind of in the middle there, we have a number of state systems, and then also the presidency. And so we're just kind of looking at where these different institutes break down. I did want to look at this data not only from a like where does the most confidence, but also knowing that these don't always perfectly line up. Where also do people have the least amount of confidence? And so over here, we saw that the organizations that had the least amount, which aligns well, you know, the House and the Senate were both at the bottom of the list on most confidence. The one that pops out here is the presidency, in part because, or surprising because that was kind of more towards the middle of the list. So again, we see that dichotomy of perspective on the executive branch. Also, when we look at there's less confidence in voting and election systems across the nation, but that's not consistent with how people view the systems within their county. And so we also see that we have relatively high levels of little confidence in the state legislature and the governor and the executive branch. So with about 30% of people saying they have little confidence in those entities. For the first time this year, we asked a demographic question about political affiliation. We know it's a common question across a number of different surveys. I think we've kind of inched our way into this. We started asking about, we didn't ask specifically about political affiliation, but we looked at, over the last several years, we asked how people see themselves in comparison to their community as it relates to social issues or financial issues. So people could say whether or not they see themselves as more liberal or conservative. The labels of Republican or Democrat or independent seem to be an important demographic characteristic. And so I think these results specifically kind of help pan that out a little bit. We know that there's a large majority or greater than majority of our rural respondents or rural Nebraska are registered Republicans. And so, you know, trying to get an idea of is that an important characteristic or factor as people are judging or the way that they make sense of their trust. And so when we looked at breaking this apart by looking at political affiliation and confidence in the presidency and executive branch, we do see on the left side here, we do see, you know, a pretty distinct pattern. So folks who identified that they were Republican or see themselves as Republican, you know, over 50% of those folks either said they had quite a lot or a great deal of confidence in the presidency, which is, I mean, the idea that they would have more confidence than the Democrats makes a lot of sense, right? Because, you know, that's who they would have likely voted for, the representative of their party, as opposed to the Democrats and their party not being represented in the executive branch. But we see a very high number of respondents who said they were Democrats having very little confidence. And so, you know, 87% there. And we see that independent was another category. Other was people who either didn't identify with any of those parties or any of those labels. There weren't very many though. Of the percentage, it was a very small percentage of our respondents. So the major three grouping of Republican, Independent, Democrat were the largest categories. Um, and then we also looked at that by the governor and state executive branch. And so again, we see the Republican respondents having, in this case, about 60% had very little or some confidence in the governor and state executive branch. And we see, quite a lot and a great deal. We're about 40%. So not a, when we look at that again, we see that for Republicans, they're more likely to be supportive of the presidency than they are of the governor and the branch in that branch, which again kind of goes counter to our general narrative about closer is more trusted. When we look at independent, we see a pretty drastic shift in comparison to the federal executive branch in the presidency, with 51% having little versus the 74. But still there's not a great deal of confidence in that institution from independents. Democrats as well identified that the majority say they have very little, but it's less than the presidency. So what I take away from this is that Republicans are less likely to trust the governor and in comparison to the presidency, but independents and Democrats are more likely to trust the governor than the president right now in our current political system. And one of the connections I wanted to make was just kind of connecting back to something that we asked last year, which is when we asked about experience with political conflicts. And over the last couple of years in 2023 and 2024, we asked folks about the civil discourse in politics and whether or not it was worse today than it had been. And so our respondents, overwhelmingly, over 90% of our respondents said that it's worse today than it was 10 years ago. And that was what we asked in 2023. We asked that in 2024, which had very similar results. And then in 2024, we also tried to dig into so what are the consequences of that? What does it mean when we have civil discourse challenges within our politics? And this was the question that we came up with last year that we asked. And so the first question is asking, do you have friends or family members with whom that have different political views from their own? So 86% of folks do, and that's probably what we would expect. But then we also asked, are there family members with whom you no longer speak? So 27% of our respondents said that was the case for them. And then 28% said that they have friends with whom they no longer speak because of political views. And so when we combine those two categories, so there's a lot of overlap. Some people would have said that they have both friends and family members with whom they no longer speak. But when we look at that, so 38% of our respondents, so well over a third of our respondents in 2024, had kind of articulated a very real impact of this, the polarization that I think we're experiencing within our politics, and perhaps within our trust in institutions, is that we are having a hard time seeing the world in a consistent way, or even seeing the world in a way that allows us to communicate or to build strong bonds. And so much so that we have to cut those bonds altogether. And that, I don't want to be an alarmist, but it does worry me. It does tell me that the impact is real when we start, losing friends and not being able to speak with friends and family members because of our politics. And I think as we look through the results, we see several instances of where we see this polarization, where we see people kind of really experiencing um, uh, our institutions in very different ways. And then one of the last things that I wanted to point out, and so this is where we looked at the amount of people who said they had a great deal of confidence over time. So like I mentioned, we asked in 2017, 2021, and 2025. And so in several cases, the trust in institutions has stayed relatively constant. We've seen some shift. So even though public safety agencies were the highest trusted in this year's poll, it's lower than it has been in previous years. We can see that in public schools, the amount of people identifying or saying they have a great deal of trust has gone down after being relatively consistent. Voting and election systems, relatively consistent, especially when we think about voting and election systems in counties. Remember, our error rate is plus or minus 3%. So all of 3 years are within that margin of error. And so that has largely remained consistent. What strikes me is that knowing that in 2021 or 2022, when the amendment to the Constitution was implemented to require voter identification within Nebraska, that didn't move people's trust really. People still have the same. And maybe it's because it's a newer, it's still relatively new. We haven't had that many elections where that's been enacted. Maybe it's not working the way people expected it to. I'm not sure. I'm sure there are other people who could speak more informed on that. But just knowing that was a major policy shift over the course of these, 8 years that we've been asking these questions, that's kind of one that sticks out to me as particularly interesting. So when we look at the presidency, the executive branch, we see a little bit of shifting from 11%. So 2017 would have been President Trump's first term as president. And then in 2021 would have been when President Biden was in office. And then 2025, we see a 17%. So we see a little bit of a shift. Again, not super surprising that we see a shift in trust from our rural respondents, knowing in general the political the way the political party affiliations across rural Nebraska. We saw a little bit of a dip in local and municipal government. Actually, let me take a step back. One of the other things that I think is relatively interesting, forgot to mention this with public schools. I would have expected or thought that a drop from 2017 to 2021, because if you'll recall 2021, and maybe some of you have intentionally blocked this out, that would have been kind of at a high point in the pandemic. It's kind of the second year of the pandemic and COVID-19, and so schools had largely kind of institutionalized their responses by that point. And so, all right, sorry about that. And so when we look at public schools, there's a dip, and I don't know what caused that dip, but I'm surprised that if there was a dip, it didn't happen in 2021. A lot of the other, so we saw a little bit of a dip in local and municipal government. Voting and election systems nationwide remained relatively consistent. the governor stayed relatively consistent. I think everything at the bottom of the list stayed relatively consistent, in part because I think there wasn't a lot of shift with them being so relatively low, and kind of being kind of close to that bottom range. So um, I think all of these data are interesting to look at, and appreciating kind of trying to understand um, what's happening that might be causing some of these shifts. And of course, we can't know for sure. Um, and but I do think that as I think about how we can use this data intentionally, I think about communities maybe being able to look at this data and bringing people together to say, like, why is this happening? Why did we see an increase? Kind of taking a strength-based approach and saying, like, what are we doing well? What are the things that we appreciate that's happening? Um, what are some of the ways that we can continue to improve the trust that we have in our local institutions? Um, I'm a little bit at a loss as to how we navigate the trust in institutions kind of at a broader level, at the federal level. I think that's going to be something that I think we're going to continue to kind of wrestle with, and um, I think it's going to shift every time we have an election, especially if it shifts, if the party in the White House changes. But it'll be interesting to see whether or not over the course of time, the degree to which Nebraskans in general have greater or less confidence in that institution, um, and kind of continuing to monitor that. And the same thing with our state systems. So with that, that's a lot of the data I wanted to present today. I was going to take the opportunity also to just mention that we have a number of other opportunities to hear about the rural poll. Like I mentioned, the highlight of my fall is the rural poll reports and the rural poll presentation. So today marked our first one in a couple of weeks. We have a great webinar on trade policy, and so you'll see that report being released here soon. Then we have well-being, and really talking about individual well-being. And then we had a series of questions around energy resources and agriculture, and what kind of energy sources are being used, and what are people's perspectives on that. That was a new set of questions. We also had a set of questions on biosecurity and bioeconomy, which was an interesting topic as well, to kind of think about how Nebraskans perceive biosecurity and kind of the growth or change within the bioeconomy. And then we have another special topic of algorithms, kind of building off of some of the artificial intelligence questions we asked last year, kind of trying to get an idea of how do people think about algorithms, and how they use them, or to what degree they're being used by them. And then our last topic will be likely sometime in January, focused on community. And so some of our regular questions that we have about people's perceptions of their communities, and being able to use that, be able to share some of the insights. That's always good because we get to look, we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Rural Poll this year. And so some of our community questions are the ones that have been on the poll for 30 years. So we can really take a long view of how people are thinking about their community. And so that's pretty exciting that we'll be able to tap into that this year. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions or comments or thoughts. And before I do that, I guess I want to apologize for whatever popped up there a few minutes ago. I'm very sorry about that.
Thank you for your
But
professionalism during that.
yeah.
Somebody requested access at I don't know, terrible thing. Apologies to anybody who's seen that or heard the foul mouth.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. But and then Audrey, oh, great point out to All Things Nebraska. All Things Nebraska, the rural poll is now, our data is getting entered into All Things Nebraska. And so All Things Nebraska has lots of data. It pools data together. Katie's on our team who works and supports All Things Nebraska. And we've been working with the team from CARES at Missouri to get rural poll data. They have, so it's not ready quite yet, but this data that I shared today will be in All Things Nebraska soon. And so you'll be able to look at data for smaller regions. You'll be able to look at and ask questions that might be of interest to you and break it down in different ways. That'll be a resource that should be available in the next week or so. They're working on putting that data in, and then as we release each report, that data should be available in All Things Nebraska shortly thereafter, if not at the same time. So you can always look at the data in more detail. So here's where I'll open it up to questions.
I did have a question for you. Have you noticed, I know this is the first year you've started asking about independent, Democrat versus Republican. Do you feel like there would have been a shift in an increase in independents, or what does the ratio look like between Democrats and independents versus Republicans in the state?
Yeah, that's it. Like, it is the first time we've asked that question. I think one of the things that I'm interested in doing is maybe doing a little bit more analysis to look at how does that map on the questions that we've asked in the past about people's perceptions of being liberal or conservative um, on both social issues and economic issues. Um, I think the other thing that we can do is I think there's pretty good data on um, and actually probably excellent data on knowing how many people are registered as Republican, Independent, or Democrat. And so we haven't done this yet, but using that as one of our variables to see how representative our sample is. So those are some of the ways that I can imagine us using that particular question. But the idea of shifts, that would be something that I think you could look at with objective data that is available. I haven't done that analysis myself, but I'm sure it's out there and would be interesting to look at. But we haven't asked that question long enough. I don't think we've seen a lot of shifts in people's responses to to the way that they describe themselves in terms of conservative or liberal or moderate. We haven't seen anything drastic in those shifts. So my guess is that it's pretty constant.
All right. Any other questions or anything for Dr. McElravy?
Hey guys, LJ, good job keeping your poise there during that deal. Hey, thanks for taking time to explain this to us. Data is important, right? So I'm economic development in Fall City and look forward to using some of this data to our advantage. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks. Appreciate that. And if there's anything we can do to help support that, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you.
Daniel had a question in the chat, and he appreciated seeing the trends on a great deal of confidence. Since these are often polarizing, do you have a similar chart on the trends in the very little confidence over the past three polls?
Daniel, that's a good question. That same question piqued my interest, and so I'm actually in the process of doing some of that right now to try to tease that out. I don't know if I think the question on people's political identity or political affiliation really helped solidify that polarization perspective for me. And so that's kind of an impetus for me going back into the data now, kind of having seen just how bifurcated that data is. So my plan is to go back in, and I'm happy to share that with you once I do that exploration.
Any reason, I got another question. Any thoughts on why the trust in the Senate might be so low, as well as the House, given those are also elected representatives? It just seems like such a contrast compared to the president.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I'm trying to remember when the when we've asked in the past just about like the civil discourse, and it feels like the discussion in politics, I think, is I think people have a perspective that it's particularly bad right now. And so I would say the fact that the executive branch is seen differently is interesting. If we kind of loop that together, because again, the presidency was seen even higher than our state, the governor, and we would expect that to be a little different. And so, yeah, I would say what's interesting is that maybe is where I might expect it to be. The presidency not being aligned with those is what I find interesting, because right now all of our Nebraska representatives in both the state and the House are all from the same party. So that's interesting that there's such a difference. Thanks, Heather. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, Daniel, when we ask questions like that, people tend to not like. It's similar to so Daniel mentioned, people's confidence in that the body or the House of Representatives versus their representative. There is a difference there. Similar to when you look at people don't like, or people don't have a lot of trust in voting systems across the nation, but they had quite a bit of confidence in the voting system in their county. So I think we see that pretty regularly. That would be my expectation.
All right, any last questions for LJ before we wrap this webinar up?
One thing that I noticed, there's a lot of talk of property taxes, right? And how can you eliminate them? There's a large percentage of property taxes that go to funding schools. I think one of the speculations out there is, there's a big want and a need to keep local control of schools, which in the end probably costs the taxpayers a little more. Would you say that the data that's shown here is that there is confidence in schools, and so there's maybe no action to be taken by the legislature to say, hey, we're going to take control of this? Or is it the other side that's saying, there's not much confidence in schools out there, we might as well just take control of this and see if we can cut the budget to help remedy some of the taxpayer burden?
Yeah.
How would you decipher that data in relationship to that?
I appreciate that question. If I look at if I go back to confidence institutions more broadly, I think this paints the easiest picture to read. If we look at the public schools specifically, with 17% saying they have a great deal of confidence, 39% saying quite a lot. So when we have more than 50% saying that they have quite a lot or more confidence in institutions, that indicates something's going well, at least for the majority of folks. I also think it could be very local, right? Like there could be elements of this that are hyper local about people's confidence in their public school system, whether or not it's working in one community versus another. We haven't been able to do that analysis specifically, but I'd have to look to see whether or not even regionally we have some of that data. I wouldn't necessarily take the conclusion that this tells us one way or the other. But to your point, even community colleges are another source of local tax revenue, and people were quite confident in community colleges, and so that would seem to be something that you wouldn't want to erode that trust, given that it's so high, of the most trusted institutions on our survey. Yeah, but the public schools, there seems to be opportunities to enhance trust quite a bit. And so what would do that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, there's only 10% of people that say they have very little trust in the schools. I don't think this is the data point where the legislature can say, we're taking that control away from the locals, we're going to cut the budgets, to try to fix this, what they view as a problem.
Right. Yeah. I think if anyone was using this data, they'd be doing it with a predetermined position.
Have you seen that trust in schools or colleges degrade post-COVID?
So, sorry, I don't want to make you dizzy, but looking we saw a decrease in trust from 23 to 17. Um, I mean, if we look at this data, but we also look at, there've been some um, there's been some petitions across the state focused on public schools as well, and where funding should go, and those seem to be informative as well, and the referendum that we had statewide on public school funding. So it would seem to me that there is trust. We have seen it decline. It didn't. The decline is such that it doesn't necessarily, to me, suggest COVID, just given the timing, unless there was just a little bit of a delay. Maybe 2021 was too early, but I would have expected to see more of a decline in 2021 if it was truly related to COVID. But maybe hindsight, maybe now having this understanding what the consequences of the decisions are, maybe people feel differently now. Maybe there's more insight today than there was in 2021 about what the impact was. I think we have more data on the impact on learning for youth. We have more of an idea on the impact from a health perspective on what was occurring during that time. Hindsight is being able to look back is easier than predicting the future.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you, LJ, for taking the time to teach us all about civic trust and institutions. Again, one last chance for any questions you may have for Dr. McElravy. But other than that, thank you for taking your time. I would encourage you to sign up for our Civic Health Conference, which will be taking place May 19th. That'll be taking place at the Innovation Campus on Lincoln. I will replace this. So you should be able to see a link on there now. If you want to get a copy of the Civic Health Index, feel free to scan that QR code, as well as sign up for a save the date. But other than that, thank you for taking the time to be here today, and to care about your community and to want to learn more.